The belly of the Sherman tank tipped skyward, metal grinding against ancient earth as the 30-ton beast climbed the hedgerow. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the tank hung there, tracks spinning uselessly in the air, its thin underside armor exposed to the German gunners waiting on the other side. The boys inside knew what was coming. They always knew. Then came the hollow thump of the Panzerfaust hitting home, and another American crew died in the hell that was Normandy. It was July 1904, and the greatest invasion force ever assembled was bleeding to death in French farmland, stopped cold by walls of earth and vegetation that had been growing for 800 years. Tanks that had crushed Hitler's Atlantic Wall were being destroyed at a rate of 3 or 4 per day, and nobody, not the generals, not the engineers, not the brilliant minds back in Washington, could figure out how to fix it. The bokage was killing them all. Then a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey, a guy who had driven an oil truck during the Depression and trimmed windows for a liquor company, picked up a welding torch and changed everything. His name was Curtis Coolin, and in less than a week, his stupid simple idea would turn the tide of the entire war in Europe. But here's the thing, he didn't even come up with the idea himself, and the man who did got laughed out of the room. Before we get into how one man's invention saved thousands of lives and possibly shortened World War II by weeks or even months, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This is a story about innovation under fire, about listening to the crazy ideas when everyone else is laughing, and about how sometimes the best solutions come from the guys getting shot at, not the ones drawing maps in safe rooms miles away. June 6, 1904, D-Day. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. By the end of that first terrible day, they had a foothold. By the end of June, they had landed over 850,000 men and 148,000 vehicles. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress, had been breached. The Americans, British, and Canadians were in France, and Berlin was starting to sweat. But then they hit the hedgerows, and everything stopped. The bocage, that's what the French called it. Centuries of Norman farmers pulling rocks from their fields and stacking them along property lines. Over time, dirt accumulated on these stone walls. Bushes grew, trees took root. By 1944, these weren't just hedges, they were living fortresses, earthen walls 4 feet high and sometimes 12 feet thick, crowned with dense tangles of brush and trees that could reach 15 to 20 feet into the air. Some of these hedgerows had been growing since the Middle Ages. The roots intertwined so tightly, you couldn't dig through them, even with machinery, and they were everywhere. From above, Normandy looked like a giant waffle. Thousands of tiny, irregular fields, none bigger than a couple of football fields, each one surrounded by these impenetrable walls. The fields were connected by sunken roads, narrow lanes that had been used for so long they had been worn down below the level of the surrounding land, creating natural trenches roofed over by the trees growing on the hedgerows. It was like fighting in green tunnels. For the defending Germans, it was paradise. Every field was a natural fortress. Every hedgerow concealed machine gun nests, mortar positions, anti-tank guns. The narrow lanes became kill zones, where a single well-placed gun could stop an entire column. The Germans would let American infantry advance into a field, then open up from 3 sides with interlocking fire. By the time the Americans figured out where the fire was coming from, half the squad would be down. And the tanks were supposed to be the answer. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the American armored force. Reliable, tough, mass-produced in numbers that Germany couldn't match. The Americans had hundreds of them in Normandy, but in the bocage, they were death traps. Here's why. When a Sherman approached a hedgerow, it had 2 options. It could try to find a gap, one of the few openings the farmers had left for accessing the fields. But the Germans knew where every single gap was, and they had pre-sighted their anti-tank guns to cover them. A Sherman rolling through a gap was like a man sticking his head through a door he knew had a shotgun aimed at it. The other option was to go over the hedgerow, to just drive the tank up and over the earthen wall. And technically, a Sherman could do it. The tank had the power. But here's the problem. When a 30-ton tank climbs a 4-foot wall, basic physics takes over. The front end goes up, way up, and for several seconds the tank is essentially belly up. Its thinnest armor, just an inch or 2 of steel, pointed directly at the enemy. Meanwhile, every gun on that tank The 75mm main cannon, the hull-mounted machine gun, the turret guns, they're all pointing at the sky, useless. The German gunners on the other side of the hedgerow would just wait. They'd hear the American tank coming, hear the engine revving, hear the treads chewing into the earth. They'd watch the tank's nose appear over the top of the hedgerow, watch it hang there, suspended, helpless. Then they'd put a round into the belly, and that would be it. Panzerfaust, Panzerschreck, even a well-placed grenade could do the job. The Sherman would brew up, that's what the tank crews called it, because of how fast they caught fire. 30-ton coffin, cooking off in the Norman sun. The crews knew. Every time a tank commander ordered his driver to take a hedgerow, everybody inside knew they might have just seconds to live. Some crews would bail out before attempting the climb, preferring to risk German fire on foot rather than be trapped in a burning tank. You can't blame them. Tank crewmen in Normandy had one of the worst survival rates of any job in the American military. 3, 4, 5 tanks a day, every single day, gone. And for what? To advance 200 yards. 300 on a good day. The casualties were staggering, and I need you to understand the scale here. In June alone, June of 1904, the Americans suffered 39,000 casualties killed, wounded, or missing, just in 1 month. Some divisions took over 100% casualties, which means they lost more men than their original strength and had to be constantly refilled with green replacements who didn't know the terrain, didn't know the tactics, and died even faster than the veterans they were replacing. The 29th Infantry Division, one of the units that had stormed Omaha Beach, reported losing 1 man for every 3 meters of ground gained in some sectors. The 79th Infantry Division fought for days to capture the village of Montgardon near La Haye-du-Puys, and when they finally took it, they counted the cost. They had lost 5,000 men for one village. And it wasn't just the frontline troops dying. Medics, engineers, anybody who had to move through those hedgerows was at risk. The Germans had had months to prepare their positions. They knew every sight line, every field of fire. They dug their foxholes directly into the hedgerows themselves, giving them overhead cover from artillery. American shells would explode in the treetops, and the Germans in their earthen bunkers would just shake off the dirt and keep firing. The Allied generals knew they had a problem. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, had predicted they'd reach the open country around St. Lo within days of the landing. Instead, here it was the end of June, and they were still grinding through the bocage, field by bloody field. The British and Canadians were stuck too, fighting for the city of Caen in the east, but at least they were on more open ground. The Americans were in the worst of the hedgerow country, and there was no end in sight. They tried everything. Combat engineers would go forward and blow holes in the hedgerows with explosives, creating gaps for the tanks to push through. But the explosions gave away their position, and by the time the smoke cleared, German gunners were ready and waiting. Plus, it was slow, dangerous work. Engineers had to crawl forward under fire, place the charges, get clear, detonate, and then hope the gap was big enough. Often it wasn't. They tried modifying bulldozers to push through the hedgerows, but bulldozers are slow, conspicuous, and completely unarmored. German gunners learned to target them specifically, knowing that taking out the bulldozer meant the entire advance would stall. The bulldozers became priority targets. Some units tried using tanks with engineer teams. The tank would ram into the hedgerow with prongs shaped like artillery shells, driving them deep into the earth. Then engineers would rush forward and stuff explosives into the holes, detonate them, and hope the blast would create a tank-sized opening. But again, the noise gave away their position, and the whole process took time. Time the Germans used to adjust their aim and bring down fire. Nothing worked, or rather, nothing worked well enough, fast enough to justify the casualties. The bocage was designed by nature and improved by 8 centuries of farming to be the perfect defensive terrain. And the American Army, for all its equipment and firepower and industrial might, was stumbling through it like a blind giant, taking hit after hit, unable to leverage any of its advantages. And then came late June, early July, exact dates unclear because nobody thought it was important enough to write down at first. Just another bull session between soldiers trying not to think about the next patrol. A group of men from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron were talking. The 102nd was a New Jersey National Guard unit, the Essex Troop they called themselves, attached to the 2nd Armored Division. These weren't West Point graduates or professional soldiers. These were citizen soldiers, guys who had joined the Guard before the war for the extra pay. Maybe for the camaraderie, never expecting to end up in France getting shot at. They were talking about the hedgerows because that's what everybody talked about when they had a spare minute. How do we get through them? How do we stop dying every time we try to advance a few hundred yards? Dozens of ideas got thrown around, most of them impractical, some of them crazy. But that's how it worked. Soldiers in the field had a different perspective than officers in headquarters. They saw the problem up close, personal, covered in blood and mud. And somebody, we don't know his name for certain, but according to most accounts his name was Roberts, from Tennessee, said something that made the rest of the group laugh. He said, "Why don't we just weld some saw teeth on the front of the tanks and cut through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them?" Everybody laughed. It was absurd. Saw teeth on a tank? Like what? We're going to turn a Sherman into a lumber mill? Cut through 800-year-old roots with hacksaw blades? Come on. But one man didn't laugh. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III grabbed a pencil. Curtis Cullen was 29 years old, ancient by military standards. Most of the guys around him were 19, 20, maybe 21. Cullen had been born in Cranford, New Jersey in February of 1915, which made him a young man during the depths of the Great Depression. He'd graduated from high school in 1938, when jobs were still scarce and the economy was still struggling. He'd wanted to go to college, but his family needed him to work, so he took what he could get. He drove an oil truck for the Sinclair Oil Company. Later, he got a job with Shenley Industries, the liquor company where his father worked, as a sales promotion assistant. Basically, he trimmed windows, decorated displays, did clerical work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. In 1938, he joined the New Jersey National Guard, the Essex Troop, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a mounted unit that still trained on horseback. Elite wasn't quite the word, but they were proud. They did exhibitions, riding displays, competitions. It was a good unit with good men, and it paid a little extra. Cullen was quiet, serious, the kind of guy who worked hard and didn't cause trouble. Then came Pearl Harbor. The National Guard got federalized, which meant everybody was now in the regular army, whether they liked it or not. The Essex Troop gave up their horses, thank God, because cavalry charges weren't going to work against panzers, and they became a reconnaissance squadron, attached to the 2nd Armored Division. They trained in the States, then shipped to England in 1943, and on June 6, 1904, they landed in Normandy as part of the follow-on waves. By late June, they'd seen enough combat to know what worked and what didn't. And what definitely didn't work was trying to get tanks over hedgerows. Cullen had watched crews die. He'd seen the Shermans belly up, helpless, taking fire. He'd heard the screams over the radio, the frantic calls for help that cut off mid-sentence when the tank exploded. He knew men who hadn't come back. So, when Roberts made his joke about saw teeth, Cullen heard something different. He heard a solution. Think about it. What if you didn't climb over the hedgerow? What if you went through it instead? Not at the top, where the tangle of brush and trees was thickest, but at the base, where it was mostly earth and roots. If you could attach something to the front of a tank, something strong enough to dig into that earthen wall and hold the tank's nose down, you could push straight through at ground level. The belly armor would stay protected. The guns would stay horizontal. The tank would keep moving, keep fighting, instead of hanging there like a target in a shooting gallery. Cullen started sketching. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have advanced degrees or formal training in metallurgy or armor design, but he'd worked with his hands his whole life. He knew welding, he knew steel, and he knew tanks because he'd been living in one for weeks. His idea was simple, almost stupidly so. Take steel beams, cut them to length, sharpen the ends, angle them forward, and weld them onto the front of the tank. 4 prongs, like tusks, like the horns on a rhinoceros. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the tusks would dig in, bite into the earth, pin the tank's nose down, and the sheer weight and power of the tank would drive it forward, bulldozing through the wall instead of climbing over it. But where do you get steel beams in the middle of a war zone? You can't exactly order them from a factory back in the States and wait 6 weeks for delivery. Cullen needed steel, and he needed it now. And he needed it to be strong enough to withstand the force of a 30-ton tank driving through an earthen wall at speed. Then he remembered the beaches. Back on D-Day, when the invasion fleet was approaching Normandy, the Germans had been waiting. They'd spent months preparing obstacles to stop the landing craft. One of the most common obstacles was something called a check hedgehog, a defensive structure made from 3 steel I-beams welded together at angles to form a giant 6-pointed jack, like something a kid would play with, but 7 feet tall and made of heavy industrial steel. The Germans had scattered thousands of them along the beaches, between the high and low tide lines. The idea was that when the landing craft came in, they'd get hung up on these hedgehogs, maybe even rip their hulls open, definitely stop them from reaching the beach. It hadn't worked. The Allies had come in at low tide, or they'd blown paths through the obstacles, or they'd just driven over them. By late June, the beaches were secure, and all those steel hedgehogs were just lying there, scrap metal nobody had bothered to clean up. Perfect. Cullen got permission, though how much official permission versus just doing it is unclear, and he organized a work party. They went back to the beaches, found some hedgehogs, and dragged them inland. Then Cullen and his team got to work with cutting torches and welding equipment. They cut the I-beams into shorter lengths, maybe 2 or 3 feet each. They angled the ends, sharpened them so they'd bite into the earth instead of just pushing against it. Then they welded 4 of these prongs onto the front of a tank, attached to the armored transmission housing, angled forward and down. The whole contraption looked ridiculous. It looked like a tank had grown tusks, or like somebody had strapped a giant fork to the front end. The guys started calling it the rhinoceros, or just the rhino, because of how it charged through obstacles. But nobody knew if it would actually work. The steel was strong enough, sure, but would it hold under the forces involved? Would the welds crack? Would the prongs bend or snap off? Would the tank just get stuck, impaled on its own device? An even easier target than before? There was only one way to find out. Mid-July, probably around the 14th or 15th, though sources vary, they took the modified tank out for a test. Found a hedgerow away from the front lines, away from German observers, somewhere they could fail without getting killed. Cullen's crew climbed in. The driver revved the engine, 30 tons of American steel and innovation aimed at 800 years of French agriculture. Then the driver hit the gas. The tank surged forward. The 4 steel tusks hit the hedgerow and bit in, digging into the earth and roots. The nose of the tank stayed level, parallel to the ground, belly armor protected. The engine roared. Dirt exploded upward in huge clods. Roots tore. Free, bushes and small trees got uprooted and pushed aside. And the tank kept going, pushing through the wall like it wasn't even there. 10 miles an hour, that's what the reports say. The Rhino tank hit the hedgerow at 10 miles an hour and burst through in seconds, covered in dirt and vegetation, but intact, functional, ready to keep fighting. The crew was alive, the tank was operational, and the hole they'd punched was big enough for other tanks to follow. It worked. They tried it again. And again. Every time, same result. The tusks held. The welds held. The tank pushed through without exposing its belly, without getting stuck, without turning into a death trap. This wasn't theory. This wasn't some general's bright idea that looked good on paper, but fell apart under fire. This was a field expedient solution, invented by soldiers who were dying, tested by soldiers who had everything to lose, and it worked. Word got up the chain. Major General Leonard Giroux, commanding V Corps, heard about it and wanted to see for himself. He was skeptical, you have to understand. Giroux was a West Point graduate, a professional soldier, and he had seen a lot of clever ideas fail in combat. But he went to watch the demonstration anyway, probably expecting to politely tell Cullen thanks, but no thanks, and then go back to trying to figure out some other solution. General Giroux brought his staff, and he also brought General Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley, commanding general of the entire U.S. First Army, the man responsible for hundreds of thousands of American lives. The man who was under immense pressure from Eisenhower and Washington to break out of the bocage and get the war moving again. Bradley had been wrestling with the hedgerow problem since D-Day. He'd authorized attacks, approved tactics, brought in engineers and equipment, and none of it was working fast enough. His casualties were mounting, his schedule was slipping, and the British were starting to whisper that the Americans couldn't handle the bocage. Bradley showed up, probably not expecting much, but willing to watch anything that might help. They rolled out the modified Sherman. Cullen wasn't driving this time, just one of the crew, watching from the side as a light tank equipped with the tusks backed off from a hedgerow, then accelerated straight at it. The tank hit the wall. The tusks dug in. Dirt exploded skyward in a huge canopy, roots tore, bushes flew. The tank pushed through in seconds and came out the other side, intact and ready for more. Bradley watched in awe. That's the word he used later in his memoirs. Awe. A hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman bursting through. Then they brought out a Sherman, heavier, more powerful. Same result. The tusks bit into the earth, pinned the belly down, and the tank bulldozed through without any part of it pointing skyward. The crew was safe. The guns stayed horizontal. The tank stayed in the fight. Bradley turned to his staff. He said, absurdly simple, something to that effect. This device, this field modification that a sergeant had cobbled together from scrap metal in a matter of days, was so obvious, so straightforward, that Bradley couldn't believe nobody had thought of it sooner. It had baffled the entire U.S. Army for more than 5 weeks. 5 weeks of grinding casualties and slow progress. And the answer had been sitting there the whole time in the form of German beach obstacles and a Tennessee soldier's joke. Bradley made a decision right there. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros, his chief ordnance officer, to start mass-producing these devices immediately. Not 100, not a few dozen to test in combat. 500. 500 Rhino modifications as fast as possible, using every scrap of German beach obstacle steel they could find, every welder they could pull from other duties, round-the-clock production. Because Bradley knew something, he knew that in a week, maybe less, he was going to launch Operation Cobra, the biggest American offensive since D-Day, a massive attack designed to punch a hole through the German lines and break out of the bocage once and for all. And he knew that if his tanks went into Cobra the old way, climbing over hedgerows and getting shot to pieces, Cobra would fail. More men would die. The schedule would slip further. Maybe the Germans would bring up reinforcements, seal the breach, and the Allies would be stuck in Normandy until winter. But if he could equip his tanks with these Rhino devices, if he could give his armored divisions the ability to smash through hedgerows instead of climbing over them, then maybe, just maybe, Cobra would work. Maybe they could break through, get into open country, and start the kind of mobile warfare where American firepower and numbers would dominate. Medeiros got to work. He pulled in every ordnance unit in the First Army, welders, metal workers, mechanics, anybody who could cut steel and run a torch. They scoured the beaches for more hedgehogs, cut them apart, fabricated hundreds of tusk assemblies. The work went on day and night, forges glowing, sparks flying, steel being shaped into tools of war, and they kept it secret. Bradley's orders: don't use the Rhino tanks until Cobra kicks off. Don't give the Germans any warning. Let them think American tanks are still vulnerable at the hedgerows. When Cobra launches, when hundreds of modified Shermans come roaring through the German lines, smashing through hedgerows like they're made of tissue paper, the surprise will be total. The Germans won't have time to adapt. By the time Cobra was ready to launch on July 25, 1944, 60% of the tanks in the U.S. First Army had been fitted with the Cullen Rhino device. More than 1,200 M4 Sherman medium tanks, nearly 700 M5A1 Stuart light tanks, and almost 300 M10 tank destroyers, all sporting 4 steel tusks welded to their fronts. An entire armored force transformed in less than 2 weeks, all because a sergeant listened when everybody else laughed. And it wasn't just Americans. The British saw what the Americans were doing and immediately copied it. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, called them prongs instead of rhinos, but it was the same idea. They started producing their own versions, using German beach obstacles from the British sector. 600 Mark I prongs delivered by August. Another 1,000 Mark II prongs for Shermans and M10s. 500 Mark III prongs for the Cromwell tank. Even Churchill tanks, which were already pretty good at pushing through obstacles because of their weight and track design, got fitted with prongs just in case. The Allies had stumbled onto something bigger than just a tactical fix. They had discovered that their soldiers in the field, the men actually doing the fighting and dying, had ideas worth listening to. Not every idea would work, sure, but when you're losing men every day to the same problem, maybe you should be asking the guys who are facing that problem instead of just the guys with the college degrees and the maps. Operation Cobra kicked off on July 25, 1944, and it started with a disaster. The plan called for a massive aerial bombardment over 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force dropping thousands of tons of explosives on a narrow strip of German defensive positions just south of St. Lo. The bombing was supposed to pulverize the German lines, stun the defenders, and create a gap for the ground forces to exploit. But the weather was bad. Clouds obscured the target area. Some of the bombers released their loads short, and American troops who had pulled back only 200 meters from the target zone got hit by their own bombs. The 30th Infantry Division took friendly fire casualties, 25 men killed, 131 wounded. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in Europe during the war, died in that bombardment, killed by an American bomb. It was a terrible start. But the attack went forward anyway, because they were committed now, and because turning back would mean all those casualties had been for nothing. The 7 Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, spearheaded the assault. The 9th Infantry Division on the left, the 4th Infantry Division on the right, the 30th Infantry Division in the center, all of them advancing through the devastated zone where the bombs had fallen. Behind them, ready to exploit any breakthrough, the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions waited, their tanks bristling with rhino tusks. Progress on the first day was slow. The Germans were stunned, but not destroyed. The Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored units, had taken horrific casualties from the bombing, losing 25 tanks, 10 assault guns, and over 1,000 men. But the survivors were still fighting, and the hedgerows were still there, and the Americans still had to take them field by field. But then the armor came forward, and everything changed. The rhino tanks hit the hedgerows and didn't stop. They didn't climb. They didn't expose their bellies. They just plowed through, 4 steel tusks biting into earth and roots, 30 tons of American steel bulldozing through walls that had stopped them for 6 weeks. The Germans, who had been trained to wait for American tanks to climb the hedgerows and then hit them in the belly, suddenly had Shermans bursting through at ground level, guns blazing, before the German gunners could adjust their aim. It wasn't that the Rhino device made American tanks invincible. They still got hit, still took casualties. This was still combat. But now the odds had shifted. Instead of being sitting ducks for those few seconds while climbing a hedgerow, the American tanks could keep moving, keep their armor angled toward the enemy, keep their guns in the fight. The element of surprise was total. The Germans hadn't seen this coming, and by the time they figured out what was happening, American armor was already pushing deep into their rear areas. By July 26th, the second day of Cobra, the front was starting to crack. The 2nd Armored Division reached the village of Saint-Sampson-de-Bonfossé after making the biggest American advance of the day. The 9th Infantry Division pushed through Marigny. The Germans were falling back in disorder, trying to establish new defensive lines, but the Americans weren't giving them time to dig in. By July 27th, the breakthrough was complete. The German defenses south of St. Lo, which had held for 6 weeks, collapsed. American armor poured through the gap, racing south and west, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, encircling entire units. The 4th Armored Division, the vanguard of the newly activated 3rd Army under General George Patton, burst into open country and started the kind of rapid exploitation that armored divisions were designed for. The Rhino tanks kept smashing through hedgerows. Field after field, they'd hit a wall of earth and vegetation, punch through in seconds, and keep moving. German defenders who had spent weeks preparing positions in the hedgerows suddenly found those positions bypassed, outflanked, useless. The whole defensive strategy, the whole idea of using the bocage to bleed the Americans dry, fell apart. By the end of July, the Americans had advanced over 30 miles, liberated dozens of towns and villages, and inflicted catastrophic losses on the German 7th Army. The German Lext Corps, which had held the western sector, was shattered. The Panzerlehr Division was reduced to a few dozen tanks. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had fought so savagely at Omaha Beach on D-Day, was destroyed as a fighting force. And the Rhino tanks kept going. Through August, as Patton's 3rd Army raced across France, the Rhino-equipped Shermans led the way. They didn't have to deal with hedgerows in the open country south of the bocage, but whenever they hit a village, a roadblock, any kind of earthen obstacle, the tusks came in handy. The modification became standard. If you had a tank in 1st Army, you had a Rhino. The impact was enormous, but hard to quantify precisely because war is chaotic and you can't run controlled experiments. We can't rerun Operation Cobra without the Rhino tanks and see what happens, but we can look at what the generals said. Patton, never one to give compliments lightly, credited the Rhino device with saving 2 to 3 weeks of time and thousands of lives. 2 to 3 weeks in a war, where every day meant more soldiers dead, more civilians suffering under occupation, more time for the Germans to regroup and counterattack. If the Rhino tanks shortened the Normandy campaign by even 1 week, that's 7 days of casualties avoided, 7 days closer to ending the war. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, mentioned Cullen by name in a speech in 1961, nearly 20 years after the war. He told the story to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, emphasizing how a sergeant's idea, passed up through the chain of command, had been implemented within days and changed the course of the battle. Eisenhower called it an example of American ingenuity and flexibility, the willingness to listen to ideas from any source and implement them quickly if they worked. Bradley wrote about it in his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, calling the device absurdly simple and crediting Cullen with saving countless lives. He was honest about his own reaction, admitting that he had watched the demonstration in awe, unable to believe something so straightforward had eluded the Army for so long. But here's what nobody talks about enough. Curtis Cullen tried to give credit to Roberts, the Tennessee soldier who had made the original joke about saw teeth. Cullen was a humble man, uncomfortable with fame, and he knew that the idea hadn't really been his. He'd just been the one who took it seriously and made it real. But by the time Cullen tried to set the record straight, the story had already spread. Newspapers back in the States were calling it the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter. The military paperwork said Cullen. The orders for mass production said Cullen. Roberts, whoever he was, got lost in the shuffle, and history recorded Cullen as the inventor. Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the higher decorations you can get without it being for a specific act of valor under fire. The citation praised his ingenuity and his contribution to the success of the Normandy campaign. He became a minor celebrity, the sergeant who saved the invasion, the guy who beat the hedgerows. But the war wasn't done with Curtis Cullen. Several months later, in the fall of 1904, American forces were pushing into Germany. The fighting was brutal, close range, urban combat in some areas, dense forest fighting in others. The Hurtgen Forest, just inside the German border, became a meat grinder, one of the bloodiest battles the U.S. Army fought in Europe. Curtis Cullen was there, still a sergeant, still serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, still doing his job. And on one of those terrible days in the Hurtgen Forest, he stepped on a landmine. The explosion took his left leg, just below the knee. He was evacuated, rushed to a field hospital, then transferred back to the States for recovery and rehabilitation. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 while Cullen was still learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg. He'd survive, but his combat days were over. He was 30 years old, missing a leg, and trying to figure out what came next. Curtis Cullen went home to New Jersey. In 1945, he married Bernice Enright. They moved to New York City, where Cullen took a job as a liquor salesman for Schenley Industries, the same company where he'd worked before the war, the same company where his father had worked. It was steady work, decent pay, nothing glamorous. Cullen wasn't looking for glory. He'd had enough of that. He stayed in touch with some of the men from his unit, the guys who had survived, the ones who understood what the bocage had been like. They'd get together sometimes, share a drink, tell stories that nobody else would believe or understand. But mostly, Cullen just lived his life. He went to work, came home, tried to put the war behind him. His marriage to Bernice didn't last. They divorced in the early 1950s, and Cullen lived out the rest of his life in New York City, working, mostly alone, mostly quiet. He didn't talk much about the war. He didn't seek attention. The Rhino tank story would come up sometimes, reporters would track him down for an anniversary piece, and Cullen would answer their questions politely, always trying to give credit to Roberts, always downplaying his own role. Curtis Grubb Cullen III died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. Cause of death isn't widely recorded, but by that point he'd been living with the aftermath of his war injuries for nearly 20 years, on top of the regular wear and tear of life. He was buried quietly, without much fanfare. Eisenhower, who was in retirement after serving 2 terms as president, sent a telegram to Cullen's parents expressing his condolences. Even years after the war, Eisenhower remembered the sergeant whose idea had helped win Normandy. Today, in Cranford, New Jersey, Cullen's hometown, there's a memorial, a plaque on a boulder outside the municipal building, dedicated to Curtis G. Cullen III and his invention. There's a street named after him, Cullen Drive. The people of Cranford remember. The U.S. Army remembers too. There's a maintenance facility at Fort Knox named after Cullen, a permanent tribute to the sergeant who changed tank warfare with a welding torch and some scrap steel. But most people, even history buffs, even World War II enthusiasts, don't know the name Curtis Cullen. They might have heard about the Rhino tanks, seen pictures of Shermans with tusks welded on the front, read about Operation Cobra in history books, but they don't know who made it possible, or how, or why. And that's a shame, because Curtis Cullen's story is the story of World War II writ small. It's not about the grand strategies, the sweeping campaigns, the famous generals whose names everybody knows. It's about the ordinary men, the citizen soldiers, the guys who got drafted or enlisted and found themselves in hell trying to stay alive and complete the mission. And sometimes, when the situation was desperate enough, when the casualties were mounting and the generals were out of ideas, those ordinary men came up with extraordinary solutions. Cullen wasn't a genius. He wasn't a trained engineer. He didn't have a revolutionary new theory of armored warfare. He was a window trimmer from New Jersey who knew how to weld and was willing to try something everybody else thought was stupid. And because he tried, because his commanders were willing to listen, because the Army was flexible enough to implement a field modification in days instead of months, thousands of American soldiers who would have died in the bocage went home alive. The Sherman tank was never a great tank in a straight-up fight against German armor. It was undergunned, under-armored, prone to catching fire. German Panthers and Tigers could kill Shermans at ranges where Shermans couldn't even penetrate their armor. But America had one advantage that Germany didn't. And it wasn't just industrial capacity or manpower. It was the willingness to adapt, to innovate, to listen to ideas from any source and implement them if they worked. Curtis Cullen represented that advantage. He represented the American approach to war, which wasn't always pretty or efficient, but which was flexible and pragmatic. When something wasn't working, they tried something else. When soldiers in the field had ideas, officers listened. When a sergeant said he could fix the hedgerow problem with scrap metal and a welding torch, a 2-star general showed up to watch the demonstration. That's why the Allies won Normandy. Not just because of superior numbers or air power or industrial might, though all of that helped, but because when Curtis Cullen picked up a pencil and started sketching tusks for a tank, the U.S. Army paid attention. And because when Operation Cobra kicked off on July 25, 1904, 60% of American tanks had 4 steel prongs welded to their fronts, and they went through the hedgerows like a hot knife through butter, and the German defensive line that had held for 6 weeks collapsed in 3 days. And the road to Paris opened up, and the war in Europe took a decisive turn toward Allied victory. All because a Tennessee soldier told a joke, and a New Jersey sergeant took it seriously. If you found this story as incredible as I did, hit that like button and share this video. History is full of moments like this, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, names that should be remembered but aren't. Subscribe to the channel because I'm going to keep telling these stories, the ones that don't make it into the textbooks, but that change the world anyway. And leave a comment, let me know what you think about Curtis Cullen and the Rhino tanks, or if you know any other stories about innovation in combat, battlefield ingenuity, the kind of stuff that saves lives because somebody was willing to try something crazy. Curtis Cullen went to war because his country needed him. He survived the Depression by working whatever jobs he could find. He joined the National Guard for extra pay. He landed in Normandy because that's where the Army sent him. He watched his friends die in the bocage, and instead of accepting it as inevitable, he thought maybe there's a better way. And there was. 4 steel tusks, welded to the front of a tank, made from German beach obstacles. Absurdly simple, as General Bradley said. But simple solutions are often the best ones, especially when lives are on the line. Curtis Cullen saved thousands of lives. He shortened the war. He gave American tankers a fighting chance in the worst terrain imaginable, and he did it with a pencil, a sketch, a welding torch, and the willingness to take a joke seriously. That's the story of the sergeant who changed World War II. That's the story of the man who made the Sherman tank finally work in the one place it couldn't. That's Curtis Coolin, and you should remember his name.